Hello, this is Malachi Bishop with the Rehabilitation Counseling Program at the University of Kentucky, and this is Ethics in Rehabilitation Counseling. Today we're going to be talking about ethical questions, conflicts, and dilemmas, and ethical decision-making models. I think it makes sense in this discussion that we'll be having to begin by looking at areas where rehabilitation counselors have most frequently run into ethical problems over time. And we're going to do that today by looking at a couple of recent studies. So we're looking at some recent research that has identified areas where rehabilitation counselors have had ethical questions or ethical issues over time, and we're going to look specifically at 3 studies today. The first study I want to talk about is a study conducted by Shaw and Lane, and this study is available to you in the Rehabilitation Counseling Bulletin. It is a review of Ethics Committee advisory opinions, and the researchers did a content analysis of advisory opinions. The CRCC Ethics Committee has provided advisory opinions to CRCs and other stakeholders since 1996. And basically an advisory opinion is a request for advice from a counselor or other stakeholder in a situation where it is believed that the Code of Ethics does not provide sufficient guidance for the counselor or other stakeholder, and where informal consultation has not provided sufficient guidance to help the certificant or CRC determine the best course of action. So a counselor has a question, and the code and consultation has not helped him or her to figure out the best approach to answering this question or solving this problem that they're having. They can send a request to the CRCC Ethics Committee for an advisory opinion. You should be aware that the advisory opinion is not construed as legal advice, and it is not a definitive direction in a given situation, because the committee does not necessarily have all the information it would need in order to give definitive direction. So it is advice from the CRC committee based on the information that they have. You should also be aware that the CRCC has made the advisory opinions that they have provided available for download on its website. So you can go to that link on this slide here, and you can review all the advisory opinions that have been provided since 1996, and they have a searchable index. So if you have a specific question concerning confidentiality, you can go in and find the opinions that have been offered related to confidentiality. So in the period between March 1996 and November 2006, 105 requests for advisory opinions were received, and the majority of these requests were made by CRC practitioners providing direct services. Some requests were also made by employers of rehabilitation counselors who had questions about their own policies and practices. The researchers looked at the 105 requests and analyzed them by looking at the standards that were associated with the requests. What did they find? What they found was that most of the questions that counselors had fell under 3 sections of the code, and we are talking about, because this was research between 1996 and 2006, we're talking about sections of the prior code, the 2001 code. So over half, 54% of the questions were dealing with the counseling relationship, 28%, professional responsibility, 26%, and confidentiality, 17%. All the rest of the standards that were addressed were fewer than 10%, and the highest at 8% was relationships with other professionals, which we will see is also another area where people do tend to have questions. The researchers in this study also looked at the sections of the code and the standards of the code that address the questions that people had. One standard within the counseling relationship section accounted for the majority of the citations, and that was standard A3A, disclosure to clients, and almost a quarter of the citations dealt with just this question. The section of the code that was cited second most was the legal versus ethical section, and that accounted for 5 or 20%. And this section, along with the other section in the other standard in section D, is legal limitations, accounted for a combined 28% of the citations. So, looking at the areas that have most frequently have been associated with questions that counselors send to the CRC advisory opinion for an advisory opinion, the issue most frequently was asked about is when rehabilitation counselors and disclosure and issues related to that. And essentially the issue is that when rehabilitation counselors fail to effectively and comprehensively disclose the information that's needed by the client in a way that is understandable to the client, then ethical issues will arise in the course of the counseling relationship. It has also been the case that rehabilitation counselors have failed to effectively disclose all the critical information at the beginning of the counseling relationship. And some research done by Shaw, Chan, Lam, and McDougall in 2004, for example, found that to be the case, that rehabilitation counselors were not effectively disclosing at the beginning of the counseling relationship all the information that they should be disclosing. So hopefully the much more explicit description of the information that needs to be provided, and the fact that this information must be provided in writing, that is part of the most recent revision to the code, will help to alleviate a number of the ethical problems that come up with respect to disclosure. So hopefully the issue will be less of an issue in the future. The important thing to be aware of there is that the importance of beginning the counseling relationship with that good comprehensive disclosure addressing all the issues that the code now identifies. And these other issues, and I think there were only two standards in Section D dealing with ethical, legal versus ethical, and legal limitations. And basically what these two standards said in the 2001 version of the code was that rehabilitation counselors will obey the laws and statutes of the legal jurisdiction in which they practice, unless there is a conflict with the code, in which case they should seek immediate consultation and advice. And then the second one that had a lot of questions associated with it was B, legal limitations, and that section said in the earlier version that rehabilitation counselors will be familiar with and observe the legal limitations of the services they offer to clients. They will discuss the limitations, as well as the benefits available to clients they serve in order to facilitate open, honest communication and avoid unrealistic expectations. So you can see the relationship again with initial disclosure, letting the client know upfront what are the benefits and limitations of the counseling relationship. Other sections and standards that were cited frequently in questions that counselors and others brought to the CRCC Ethics Committee for advisory opinions were issues associated with respect for privacy in the confidentiality section, and minimal disclosure. And in section E, it's another section where there were more questions than some other areas. Standard E1E, employer policies, was identified in 7%, and E1A, negative conditions with employers, was identified in 5%. And it appears that these standards are related in terms of ethical questions, because many of the ethical issues for which counselors were seeking advice involved conflicts between the client's needs and external barriers to meeting those needs, including barriers from employers or the legal system or from other sources. For example, over the years there have been several questions related to the use of cubicles and other employer practices where a counselor felt like he or she was working in a situation where confidentiality and privacy were limited or affected by the work environment. Legal directives often create ethical issues, ethical discomfort, ethical questions for counselors. And this has been the case, for example, particularly in the area of workers' compensation. So a lot of the questions that were raised had to do with the work environment or interaction with legal or employer guidelines too. So summing up this study, which we're talking about in order to begin identifying what are the common ethical problems or issues that counselors face, we can see that issues having to do with professional disclosure, legal guidelines conflicting with ethical guidelines, problematic employer policies, and issues dealing with confidentiality. Those areas, questions in those areas, have frequently led counselors to seek advisory opinions, didn't feel that the code was sufficiently helpful, and they weren't able to get their questions answered with consultation. Now I want to turn to a second study. Again, trying to identify common areas where counselors run into ethical problems, and this one went about it a little differently. Tarvidos and Barros Bailey looked at ethical dilemmas that rehabilitation counselors have faced and expect to face in the future. And specifically what these researchers did was a survey where they asked counselors these questions. So in 2006, they conducted a survey, the CRCC conducted a survey of 240 CRC certificates in the US and Canada, and they had two main questions. First one was, what are the ethically challenging incidents or dilemmas that you have faced as a counselor in the past year or two? And then second, what ethically troubling issues or dilemmas do you expect to arise in the near future? Then they also asked whether the Code of Professional Ethics for Rehabilitation Counselors, and again we're talking at this point about the 2001 version, address the ethical issues that they have faced. And whether they were able to resolve the issue, and finally how they went about resolving the issue. So a number of interesting questions there, and let's see what they found. In response to question 1, the researchers conducted a two-part analysis. So first they identified the themes that best described the reported dilemmas. So they organized all the dilemmas that the respondents told them about into themes, and then they determined which ethical standards were most relevant to the themes that were identified. And they found 9 general themes for the ethical incidents or ethical dilemmas. And the top 5, the most frequently identified 5 in order of frequency, were first of all conflicts with organizations and payers or employer pressures. So that was the most frequently identified dilemma. Second was confidentiality and exceptions to confidentiality, and that was very close to in number to the first one. The third one, also very close, autonomy and client choice, so issues dealing with autonomy and client choice. And then 4, client relationship, and 5, ethical violations by colleagues. And then looking at the ethical standards that were most relevant to the content reported, again, we see counseling relationships, confidentiality were among the most frequently involved, as we did in the first study. So issues involved in that counseling relationship section and confidentiality are showing up again as very prevalent in terms of areas where counselors have questions. And the third most frequently was professional responsibility. Now let's look at what the counselors said when they were asked about future ethically troubling issues or dilemmas. The respondents were given an open-ended question that asked them to project what might become an ethically troubling issue in the future. And basically they did identify some interesting new issues, but they also talked about issues that we're talking about right now in the present as continuing to be problematic. Within the theme of confidentiality, the main issues there included problems related to the HIPAA law, which we had talked about earlier. New laws such as the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act create potential issues for counselors in the area of confidentiality and information exchange. Release of information and family or parental contact or notification. So how do we deal with confidentiality when working with families or parents of clients? So that was one main area that people talked about. In terms of conflicts of interest, that was another area that was frequently identified, and issues here involved pitting or balancing clients' interests against those of other parties. So the interest of the client was in conflict with the goals of the employer or the payer. The respondents reported specific instances of pressure applied to them and specific types of actions by which their payer or supervisor or other representative of their employment setting created pressures that affected their ability to serve their clients optimally or render ethical services. So pressure from employers or payers for services. And the most common sub-theme in this area, which was reported by more than half of the responses, involved pressure the respondents felt to return their clients to work as rapidly as possible, despite whether the clients were prepared to return to work, and also to juggle their caseload statuses to advantage the agency. So those are issues that rehabilitation counselors have been talking about for some time and dealing with really for many years, but they continue to cause ethical problems. The other sort of new ideas that came out of this, the theme of changing client populations, provided a number of issues that we will certainly be dealing with as a profession in the next few years and decades. Things like ethical challenges that are associated with new client groups, such as older clients, clients with significant mental health issues, gamblers, people with criminal records, and returning veterans. So groups of people who we haven't traditionally maybe worked with, but we will be working with to a greater extent in the future. New ethical issues in the general theme of diversity and discrimination were also identified, including, for example, concerns about how to ethically balance the needs of undocumented workers against the eligibility requirements and legal constraints of their service programs. The third question the researchers asked had to do with whether the code was effective in helping them to deal with these issues. And when they were asked if the code addressed a past ethically troubling problem, only 40% of the rehabilitation counselors said that the code was helpful and effective. Of the remaining respondents, 40% said it was not helpful, and then 20% said that they did not know, which may suggest that at least 1 in 5 of the respondents were not familiar with their code of ethics. The researchers also asked if and how the dilemma was resolved, and 63% said that the dilemma they were talking about had been resolved. And how did they resolve it? The most frequently noted approach involved consulting with the client or other parties directly involved with the problem. That was the most frequent answer, followed by consulting with other professionals. And these two categories accounted for 42% and the major methods of resolution that were reported. Other methods that people talked about included transferring or referring the client, reviewing the code, principles, or standards, reporting the situation to an authority, and or having an investigation or resolution with some form of discipline, such as termination or discipline. So those were some of the far less frequently identified areas. I want you to be aware that the CRCC website has currently got a section on actions taken against CRCs and CRCCs. CCRCs. This section includes topics that arise most frequently in connection with ethics cases. So what the sort of things that we've been talking about. And you can also find on this website the actions that have been taken. Remember, we talked about letter of instruction, reprimand, probation, suspension, and revocation as actions that the committee may take in an adjudicated case. And so if you go to this website, you can see how frequently the committee has taken each of these actions. Okay, I want to move on to look at one more study here. And this study again took a different approach to answering this question of what are the areas that rehabilitation counselors run into problems or questions. And this was a study in 2007 by Jody Saunders, Barrows Bailey, Brudman, Dew, and Garcia. And this was a descriptive study of ethics cases that had been adjudicated by the CRCC between 1993 and 2006. And so what they did is they went into the CRCC database to evaluate information about the ethical complaints that had been made and the accused certificates. So this was a review of the cases where complaints had actually been made. And this research also looked at the question a couple of different ways. They looked at the rules that had most frequently been, where complaints had most frequently been made, and then they looked also at the standards. So what rules were counselors breaking or violating? The most frequently violated was standard 1.1 in the earlier version of the code. Again, the rehabilitation counselors will obey the laws and statutes where they practice. And at 10 violations, or 20%, Rule 1.4, rehabilitation counselors will not be dishonest or deceitful. Also, 2.3, rehabilitation counselors will avoid exploiting clients, students, and subordinates. So those two together both received 13.7%. Rule 9.3, rehabilitation counselors will not allow personal problems to lead to inadequate performance, and there were 4 violations. Rule 1.7, moral and ethical standards of behavior, and Rule 2.9, rehabilitation counselors will work with their clients in obtaining potential employment opportunities. Appropriate potential employment opportunities accounted for almost 6%. So these were the rules that were most frequently violated. And then we look at the standards. And remember, this was 1993 through 2006. So we're actually looking at 2 different codes of ethics here. The 87 version and then the 2001 version. So there was some combination of standards and rules and sections going on there. But when we look at the standards, most frequently where complaints were most frequently made, standard 8.9a, abandonment prohibited, was the most frequently violated standard with 5 violations. An example of this violation that was provided in this article was when a counselor who had sufficient time to forewarn an employer abruptly left his or her caseload without providing for the transition of clients to other rehabilitation counselors. So basically abandoned the caseload. Standard A4C, the one dealing with personal needs and values, and A6A, potential for harm, and B1A, respect for privacy, were all also found to be violated 3 times. So these are the standards that most frequently people violated or complaints were made in these areas. These researchers also looked at patterns in advisory opinions and the patterns based on the questions and complaints that the CRCC most often talked about included disclosure, informed consent, confidentiality, dual roles, legal issues, and employer relations. So, as I said when we began this discussion, I wanted to look at 3 recent studies in order to identify areas where counselors most frequently run into ethical problems or questions. And do these 3 recent studies identify any themes for us? A number of issues appear to have come up with some consistency across the 3 studies that we looked at. The issues associated with the counseling relationship were identified every time. So they were absolutely consistent. That is an area where people seem to have a lot of questions or run into ethical problems. Disclosure issues related to ethical, honest, and open relationships with clients was identified as absolutely a critical area. Again, the new code has identified explicitly the discussion that we need to have with our clients, and the fact that this also needs to be presented to clients in writing and in a manner that is appropriate for them. Other issues that appeared to be creating ongoing problems now and in the future included privacy and confidentiality of information. We talked about the cubicle issue and those sorts of employer environment issues have come up quite frequently in the last several years. And then issues in which legal and ethical issues overlap or contradict. And it was clear in this review that the practice of rehabilitation counseling, it is a profession where we would continue to see areas in which there is confusion, conflict, and questions, and dilemmas. And our next discussion, we are going to look at ways of addressing or answering these questions that come up. Sometimes these very complex ethical dilemmas that come up, and we're going to talk about a couple of models for coming up with good approaches to answering these difficult ethical questions.